and that the enclosing space is what is actually there, you can always figure it the opposite way. Now, so then, if you don't know this, if you aren't awake to the idea that you can figure it both ways, then you start taking sides. And you turn the game of the universe into a fight. Great. It's good to get involved in that sort of thing where you are so far out that you have forgotten that two sides go together and you're going to treat this like a fight. The only thing is that after a while this becomes impossible. It becomes impossible because it's simply against the nature of reality. You cannot have up without down, and so you cannot be perpetually one up on things. It's great to try to be, but it's an absolute bore to have to try to do so for too long. So eventually one comes to see that won't work. Now, why won't it work? The answer is that that's not the kind of system you're living in. Now, this goes very deep. It isn't only that the river and the tree run in two directions. It isn't just that the world creates you and you create the world. It's that when you go down to your absolutely fundamental sense of existing, here, conscious, sensitive, that, you see, this is intensely real and vital to you only because it has the possibility of not being there at all. It is, in other words, the constant possibility of death that gives the juicy vibrancy to life. And these things play each other. This is the same two-way system. Only, of course, naturally, you have to take the side of life and say, oh, that's what I want. Yeah, let's more of that. And not that death thing. No, please, no, not that. But you couldn't have the one without the other. They define each other. And the reason they define each other is that they are the two aspects, the two sides of what you are. Only, we have a thing against knowing this, so as to make it work, see? So as to make a kind of interplay or contest go on between the two. Therefore, to see through the contest between the two is what the Buddhists call nirvana. Which means if you want to, you can stop worrying about the game. Nirvana means, in other words, to check out. And say, oh, for heaven's sakes, what was I all this time upset about? Sickness, death, evil, and so on. I suddenly realized that everything I was afraid of was the opposite side, that is to say, the complementary side of who I am. So stop worrying. If, for example, I suffer and die, what happens? I go through a very energetic experience of pain and resisting pain, and all this thing goes, "Argh!" And then it fails. Clunk. See? But that builds up the energy, which actually creates a new existence. Your birth, your arrival as an itty-bitty baby in this world was the obverse of someone dying in exactly the same way as a star, as a thing inside, has an obverse of something outside in terms of space. It's all flip-flop, flip-flop, flip-flop like this.
Why has the population increased then? There seems to be more coming in.
Oh, there always is, because it gets increasingly exuberant. Just in the same way, you go back, you see, here's the explanation. Look at the flower. The stem is one. The petals are many. Then consider each petal, and you will find it has full of little veins that are going out, or in the pattern of the fern, which I mentioned this morning. A fern is a stem, then stems coming off it, and then stems coming off then, and then each little stem has a substem. That's why there's a population explosion. This is the shape of life, the shape of a tree. This is the image I'm giving you, and the point is that the tree runs both ways. It runs from the stem out to all the ends of the tubes or passages, but at the same time it is running from all the stems into the center. As the tree uses its leaves to absorb moisture, and as we use our nerve ends to absorb information from the external world. The whole thing is it runs both ways. So don't get hung up on committing yourself to one view or the other. You're both. You accept it as something that's out there, but at the same moment you create it. You are a subject, and you're also an object. Yesterday afternoon, I was explaining the theory of the Yogacara school of Mahayana Buddhism, which has to do with the tree-like design of the production of consciousness. And we went into the similarity between the symbol of the tree and the symbol of the river, where the direction of the tree seems to be from the trunk to the branches, and the direction of the river from the branches to the trunk. There was an aspect of this that I didn't complete, and that I want to complete before we go on, which is to say something more about the stem or the trunk in this theory. Just to refresh your memories, there were these words, kshetra, which means in Sanskrit the field of the senses. In other words, the kshetra is contrasted with the ayatana, which means gate. That is the sense organ itself, the eye. Then there is the field of the eye, what we call in ordinary English the visual field. And so there's likewise the sonic field. Then behind the ayatana is the vijnana, corresponding to each of the five senses. V-I-J-N-A-N-A. That's how it's romanized, vijnana. And then behind each vijnana corresponding to each sense, there is manovijnana, the mind sense, which is the sixth sense which coordinates all the others, under the supposition, you see, that all the senses are simply differentiations of one sense, a fundamental kind of touch. Then behind mano-vijnana is manas, which is the mind, manas having the same root as the word man, and then to go on, something I didn't cover yesterday, manas is considered as rooted in the alaya vijnana, A-L-A-Y-A, again, vijnana. And the word alaya means store. So underneath is the store consciousness. And the nearest thing that we have to this in our Western ideas is Jung's notion of the collective unconscious. Because the alaya vijnana is supposed to be a kind of repository of the seeds of all possibilities of consciousness and life. So as you go into this tree, you stop being individually you at the level of manas. You see, that manas is pretty much what we would call the ego consciousness. Below that, in alaya vijnana, you come to a level of human existence where you can't be said to be the particular you anymore. For example, each one of us shares in common 2 eyes, 1 nose, 1 mouth, 2 arms, 2 legs. And at that level, you see, we are not individual, because we all have that in common. Then likewise, when we go further in to things that are not at all under our conscious control, the functioning of the heart, the machinations of the stomach, the shaping of the bones and all that sort of thing, this goes on at a level of life which we all share as human beings, but we don't control from voluntary power. And so everything like that is in the domain of the alaya vijnana, which you can call the collective. Now, the funny thing is, they say, not, if you translate the Sanskrit literally, it isn't the unconscious. Vijnana means conscious. And it's a very curious thing that we have used the word the unconscious as designating the deeper levels of the psyche. Because the disadvantage of this word is that it leaves out of consideration the fact that it is the unconscious that is conscious. In other words, underneath consciousness is something you're not conscious of, true. But it is what enables you to be conscious. Nobody knows how he manages to be conscious. You can be conscious of all sorts of things, and you suddenly find yourself doing this, that, and the other, and knowing this, understanding that. But how the devil do you do it, you don't know. And this is one of the weirdest things, if you sit down to contemplate it, think it out. How do you manage to be you? And so we get this funny sense of self-estrangement represented in the common notion that what I really am is a soul which has been given a body and all sorts of capacities. I've been given intelligence, I've been given the power of consciousness, etc. But I am not any of these things. I'm the recipient of these gifts. And this has become, you see, for Western man, a kind of common sense embedded in language. As when we say, I have a body, my mind, you know, as if it was something, kind of engine that I possessed. So it goes back, you see, to the whole notion that most of us, our body, our unconscious, our various powers of will and so on, are given to us by a God who has created them and understands how they work. And you're put in charge of them and you're responsible for them for the time being. So you see, when you think that way, you don't feel responsible for or one with your full organism. And insofar as you don't feel at one with your organism, very naturally, you don't feel at one with everything else. But this is simply a way of figuring life. You don't have to figure it that way. And the advantage of figuring it this way has been, of course, to develop this strong Western sense of the value of the individual person. And this indeed has in it, you see, something very great and fascinating. Just as in the same way, the Westerners developed a sense of interpreting nature as a mechanism and thinking about nature and about all living beings as machines was the essential step necessary for the production of our technology. This was Newton, this was Descartes, this was their idea of the world as a mechanical system, more or less based on the game of billiards, where atoms are balls which knock each other around and obey certain laws. Now, you understand those laws, you analyze, you understand everything by taking it apart. This is something, you see, that mankind had not really done before. Take it apart and see how it works. Then, when you understand that, you can develop surgery. You can develop microbiology, etc., etc. But then, having done that, you come to another stage where you realize that the mechanical image of nature is not adequate. And you drop it. And you go on, say, to an organic or a quantum-like image. And so the mechanical stage of thinking about the world becomes what Desjardins calls a peduncle. That is a junction system which disappears when you've gone over it. A stalk which is required to pass from one situation to another. But when you've used the stalk, it dries up and vanishes. That's a peduncle. And so in this way, the Western mechanistic view of the world is the peduncle, that leads us into our high technological civilization. But in this high technological civilization, we have to realize that the organic model of nature is in the long run more effective than the mechanical model. The Chinese always had the organic model of nature, and therefore they didn't develop a technology in our sense, because they never thought about understanding things by taking them to bits. They understand things by seeing them in context, which is the exact opposite approach to analysis. In analysis, you take any thing and you reduce it to smaller things to understand how it works. But in a context or organic way of thinking, you understand a given thing not by taking it apart, but by considering its relationships to all the other things around it. See? So, the West, having developed analysis to such a fine degree of perfection, then discovers that that's not the whole story. That you may press analysis a long, long way, but then you have to retract yourself and consider what things are in context. And therefore, the Chinese way of thinking becomes relevant to a scientific, technological culture. Now, these are two ways of motion. Well, now, let me go back. The alaya vijnana, or store consciousness, which I called the collective unconscious, is therefore the level of ourselves at which we are not individual, where we can say we are just human. And beneath alaya vijnana, there's still another which they call amala, A-M-A-L-A, which means taintless. I don't know that really this word taint in English is quite adequate. Maybe if you call it tint rather than taint is better, without a tint in it. Because you see, the mirror itself has no color. And this is pure. But you see, the trouble is when we use the notion of purity in our kind of religious background, we mean sexless. And we've forgotten that the original notion of purity, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, has nothing to do with having no sexual desires. It means clarity. It means pure like clear water, like a clean window, like a crystal. And so, a pure-mindedness is simply clear-mindedness. But you see, a clear mind is one that isn't hung up on something. When you consider, say, a crystal, if it is not clear, it's distorted. It has a flaw in it. So that when you look through glass that has a flaw in it, you see something happens to the landscape every time it goes by. You see? It suddenly goes bloop like this. And so you notice the glass is there too much. Now, the reason why God is invisible is that God has no flaw. Do you see that? and therefore doesn't appear. Is total transparency, in other words, that does not make any difference to anything at all. So the poem in Zen says, entering the forest, he does not bend a blade of grass. Entering the water, he does not make a ripple. And the track of the wise is described as the track of birds in the sky. They leave no contrail. Actually, they do. It can be photographed with infrared cameras, but so far as you'd know, they don't leave any traces. So, purity, the pure mind, means the one where you finally get down to its making no difference to anything at all. And this then, from one point of view, is the most unimportant mind that you have, because it doesn't make a difference. But from another point of view, it is the most important, because without that you wouldn't have anything. Now here comes one of the most fantastic philosophical problems of today. There has been a development in Western philosophy which we call by several names: scientific empiricism, logical positivism, logical analysis. And this is the prevailing philosophical school in the Anglo-Saxon world. It completely captured Cambridge, then Oxford, then most American universities. And you will find almost all serious philosophical practitioners today belong to this school. Now, logical positivism completely demolishes any kind of interest in metaphysics by saying, not that metaphysical statements are untrue, but that they're meaningless. That is to say, any proposition which says, for example, all things are the will of God, contains no information whatsoever. Because whatever you state about everything is a statement which is a tautology. That means it is simply saying everything is everything, only you've said it in another way. So this is a very powerful critique of the whole past history of philosophy, that it was all meaningless. People were hung up on words and were fighting with words and purely verbal problems. And so that you can only talk meaningfully about things that can be said. That is to say, you can only talk about whatever is classifiable. If, in other words, a certain experience, a sensation, is not differentiable from any other one, you can't talk about it. The thing to be manifest, to be definable, to be describable, to be experienced at all, has to have a boundary. And so you can see what is inside the boundary and differentiate it from what is outside. And so these philosophers are arguing that you can only describe what has boundaries. This is their fundamental assumption. And of course, in a way, that's quite true. But the difficulty is that this has reduced philosophy to an extremely pedestrian pursuit. The professional academic philosopher in the United States or in England today has condemned himself to a kind of wonderless attitude. The ancient philosopher, you see, lies awake at night, wondering about the meaning of existence. The modern philosopher would find that would be extremely unscholarly to do anything like that, because he must realize that when you wonder about the nature of being, you are simply suffering from an intellectual neurosis. You're out of order. Your logic has all gone wrong, and you've become bugged with words. And in a way you have. He's quite right up to a point.